I just want to thank President Horton and the Board of Trustees and the college administration for this honor. I mean, it's pretty cool to get a doctorate just for making beer. I mean, who would have thought that all those years of drinking would be the ultimate form of higher education? So I very much appreciate this, and I'm grateful that you've all invited me. So greetings to the faculty and staff and to all the graduates here. When I was invited to speak, I actually have this speech that was written for me, which is pretty long. And I'm not very good at reading things, so I've actually got a short speech. So I'm going to give you the short speech, if that's okay, because I am mindful after this is over, we're going to have a reception, and I'm going to pour you some beer. So So I'm mindful that I am one of the things standing between you and your next beer. And those of you who are attending this ceremony from afar, I hope you'll have an opportunity to pour yourself a good beer after the ceremony is done. And President Horton asked me to talk, and I asked him, well, what do you want me to talk about? What do people want from me? And being a wise man, he first said, well, beer. So we're going to handle that afterwards. And then he said maybe a little wisdom. And I really don't have much wisdom. So I'm not going to pretend to give you that, though maybe when I finish I can give you some suggestions. But what I thought I would talk about is some of the lessons that I've learned in the 30 years now since I started brewing Samuel Adams in my kitchen back in 1984. And I'll give you a little bit of the genesis of, how did I decide to make beer of all the crazy things, because this was 1984, and the American beer landscape was a wasteland. There really weren't a lot of choices. The industry had consolidated. I come from 6 generations of brewing. I'm the 6th oldest son in my family to be a brewer. So beer is literally in my blood. About 0.05, 0.06 on a good day. So I'm still legal to speak. But it has been something. I had my first beer when I was 4, and I'm still, I don't know why they made me wait so long, but my parents were very strict. And when I started thinking about, I was a manufacturing consultant, and I had a pretty good job. I was at Boston Consulting Group. I was flying around the country, first class on other people's money, so it seemed like a pretty sweet ride. But after like 5 or 6 years, it ceased to be satisfying. I wasn't really learning about business and new problems. I was learning to be a consultant. And I didn't want to be a consultant for the rest of my life, so I realized, well, if I don't want to do it for the rest of my life, that means I don't want to do it tomorrow. So I went in and gave my notice and said when all my cases are done, which was like 6 months, I want to leave. And I started thinking about what do I want to do. And I'd worked for big companies, and it really wasn't my cup of tea. So I decided I'm going to start my own company. And I started thinking about different ideas. And there were a bunch of them that were in very hot industries. It was 1984, and like personal computers, information technology, telecommunications. I mean, these were hot, growing areas with obviously a lot of potential, but I didn't really have any interest in them. And I started to think about, well, what do I really want to do? And what I wanted to do was make beer. And at that time, well, the number of breweries had gone from 1,000 when my father got out of brewmaster school in 1948 to about 40 in 1984. So 96% of the breweries had gone broke, and the industry was continuing to consolidate. And starting a small brewery to make high-quality American beer looked like insane suicide mission. I wouldn't even have made it onto Shark Tank to get laughed at. But it was what I was passionate about, what my family had done, and it was what I wanted to do. So I put together a business plan, and the business plan is embarrassing to read today, because, you know, I was at BCG, a lot of smart people. I was supposed to have some idea of, you know, how to do a reasonable, realistic business plan, and my business plan was that it would take 5 years to grow to 5,000 barrels of beer. That was about $1 million in revenue and 8 people, and it would level off after that. And that was the business plan. And luckily, I was horribly wrong, but horribly wrong in the right direction. And that 5,000 barrels turned into 3 or 4 million barrels this year. So I was off by about a factor of 800. And in some ways, in retrospect, I'm not sure whether I'm happier and better off having way exceeded my expectations, because one of my desires in starting a small business is I wouldn't have to travel. You know, I could stay home, I could stay married, and of course it didn't work out. I've traveled like 5 or 6 million miles for Sam Adams, and my wife divorced me. So you never know what you're going to get in this life. And so I'm not really sure which outcome was a happier one. And I mean, it's just true. And my point, I guess, is that, you know, when you set out maybe starting a new business or a career, you often can get distracted by opportunities that look like they can make you very rich. And the reality is that, you know, of the small businesses that start up, most of them don't even, you know, make it past their 5th year, and the number of them, you know, that make somebody really, really rich is virtually zero. I mean, the Facebooks and the Googles, those are literally 1 in a million. On the other hand, the chances that a business that you start or a career that you enter, the chances that it can make you happy if you pick the right one are much, 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 much greater. And unless you're like some kind of megalomaniac sociopath, which would you rather be, happy or rich? So I guess my point is, when you think about your future, you know, look for a future that's going to make you happy, because getting rich is life's biggest booby prize. I want to talk about a couple other things that I learned, and I have an MBA, as some of you today, and I don't know how long it took you guys. Mine took 7 years. And I had the interesting experience of going to my 5th year reunion, and people ask me, "So, Jim, you know, what are you doing now?" and I had to tell him, well, I'm graduating next week. I'm pretty proud of that. I had a somewhat unusual path, I guess, because I dropped out of business school in the middle of it and spent almost 4 years doing other things, odd jobs, and among them was being an Outward Bound instructor, the outdoor school, where I taught a bunch of things, including mountaineering. And I learned from that what I call the string theory. And the string theory, is relevant to any entrepreneur. And it's not astrophysics, it's not even finance. It's about real string. Because when I was teaching Outward Bound, your group would go out into the wilderness for 28 days, and you'd pretty much have everything you needed. You get resupplied with food and fuel once or twice, but everything else you carried. And we used this string. It was called alpine cord, but it was basically just string to do lots of things, to set up the tarps, to lash things onto packs and so forth. And I learned that if I gave my group plenty of string, invariably they would, by the end of the course, not have enough, because they would cut it into little pieces that were useless. They would leave, bits of it on trees and forget to untie it, or, they'd lash things to their pack with 3 wraps instead of 1. And at the end of the course, they wouldn't have enough. So I decided to do something different, which was not give them enough. And I learned that if I didn't give them enough, by the end of the course, they had plenty, because they learned to use it much more effectively, and they would find the bits hanging on the branch that somebody else had left and figured out how to use them. And out of that, I realized that there is a real value in not having enough resources to accomplish a goal. With Boston Beer Company, when I started, I couldn't get venture money. I couldn't get a loan. I raised my seed capital from friends, relatives, and drinking buddies, mainly in little bits of, $3,000, $4,000, and mainly with the promise that I don't know if this is going to be a good investment, but you're going to get free beer for life. And that was kind of attractive. And then, and if we go broke, we're going to have a great party at the end. And that was how I raised my money. It wasn't very much. So when we started, we really stripped away everything that we didn't need. We didn't have an office for the first 6 months. We didn't have a single computer. We didn't even have a telephone. We did all our business off an answering machine from payphones around Boston when payphones existed. And to this day, we've always tried to make do with much less resources, because we compete with these enormous global companies. It was very nice to hear the introduction about everything we've accomplished, but to keep it all in perspective, after 30 years of working my tail off, the market share of Sam Adams in the U.S. beer business is 1%. 30 years of working my tail off, and we've gotten to 1%. Now, I'm proud of that. I started this in my kitchen, and we were invisible. And then we kind of grew and worked and grew, and we got to infinitesimal. And then we worked and grew. We got to tiny. And today, after 30 years, we finally made it to small. And I think that's really cool. And at 1%, someday we can do something that Anheuser-Busch, that has 50% market share, we can do something they can't do. We can double. I can get to 2%. And to this day, we value the string theory of, and I guess the general business principle I would extract from it is that culture and values can substitute for resources and money, and substitute quite effectively. It's the strength of the weak, but I'm here to tell you that it works. A third thing that I learned in sort of reflecting on these 30 years, it also came from mountaineering, and it's about the difference between things that are scary and things that are dangerous. And in our lives, we spend way too much time worrying about the things that are scary and not enough time worrying about the things that are dangerous. As I was preparing for this, I was sort of thinking about it, and my 15-year-old daughter was telling me about how somebody got attacked by a shark. Now, the number of people get killed by sharks, and she's terribly afraid of sharks. Now, in most years, there's not a single death from a shark attack. And this is from a 15-year-old who refuses to wear a seatbelt. So that's sort of an example, but I'll give you a couple other examples of the difference between scary and dangerous, and why we shouldn't worry so much about what's scary, but worry about what's dangerous. When I quit my job to start Boston Beer Company, it seemed scary. I had a nice house, I had 2 children, a family, soon to be an alimony payment, but at the time, a family, and I had this nice job. It was pretty secure, and going out on my own, completely on my own, where the only paycheck I got came from the beer that I sold every week, was scary to me. And I called up the guy who'd been my mentor, who at that point had moved on, and he was a senior executive at General Electric, and I told him what I was doing and how risky it was. And he gave me some good advice. He said, Jim, it's not really risky. I mean, the worst thing that happens is you fail. I mean, I know you're afraid of failure, but, that's not such a bad thing, because, frankly, I would sooner hire you with 2 years of a failed entrepreneurship on your resume than 2 more years of consulting. And, all right. So, going out on my own was scary, and that kind of risk, but what was really dangerous was staying at a job that wasn't really satisfying to me, and getting, to retirement and realize, I wasted my life. That's dangerous. Starting a new company, launching a new career, launching a new job, changing a job to find something that you believe in and will be happy doing. It might be scary, but it's not risky. The real risk is never taking those chances in the first place. Another thing that I've learned in 30 years is that, and this will sound a little weird, but I think it's true, most of what we do in business is waste. And it's been a very useful perspective for me at Boston Beer Company to think about and view most of our activities as probably comprised largely of waste, which doesn't seem like what's going on, but I'll give you a couple of examples, quite different. The first one, very visual. I used to be a manufacturing consultant, and I remember timing people as they were changing a die, a stamping die, which is this thing that presses out, in this case, the fender of a car from a piece of sheet metal. And there's a die that's bolted on to this big stamping iron, and it had 8 bolts on it, big bolts, and they were each about 6 inches long, and at the bottom of them was the half-inch nut that secured the die to the stamping iron arm. And you looked at it, and of course these big bolts with all this extra height, it looked like this is secure. But the reality of it is the first 5.5 inches of that bolt were completely useless. It was only the last inch where the nut was that did all the work. The rest of it was just complete waste. And, when I watch people change them because they're big, tall things, they had to use this crescent wrench that swung around it. It took much longer. So I talked to the foreman and convinced him to just cut the first 5.5 inches off the die, off the bolt. And then you could put it on with a socket wrench. And it took 90% of the time of changing that die out of it, because 90% of it was waste. It looked like it made a stronger attachment and it was more secure, but it wasn't. It was waste. Another example from my business is beer is perishable, and about half of the degradation in beer quality happens in a wholesaler's warehouse. The wholesaler will keep 4 to 6 weeks of beer to make sure they never run out. Well, the only case that is really preventing them from running out is the one that they have when they fill the last truck before the next order. And it turned out that in the beer business, we could take basically 5 weeks worth of inventory down to 1 week. And if they had only 1 week, they could keep it cold, which further reduced the degradation. So we could take out about 96% of the degradation in the flavor of the beer. 96% of it was waste. The third example is one that is very relevant and immediate to all of you, which is what is happening in education. Because the costs, as all of you are painfully aware, the costs of education over the last 40 years have risen much faster than inflation. When I went to college, and I started in 1967, tuition, room, and board was $3,000 a year. You know, you could work your way through college. I delivered newspapers and worked in a mattress factory during the summer, and I could pay 75% of my college tuition, room, and board. My daughter is starting college this year, and I was working in that mattress factory for minimum wage, and I could still pay 3/4 of my tuition. I worked it out. My daughter, if she worked every single hour of every day for 365 days, she could not pay her college tuition, room, and board today. I mean, that's a terrible thing. It prevents access to opportunity for lots of very talented, energetic, capable, resourceful people, and somebody has to fix that problem, and New England College of Business is part of that solution. As you know, this institution has taken about 85% of the costs out of a college degree, because most of the costs of a college degree are waste. Go onto a college campus, and what do you see? Beautiful grounds so that people can, have a nice idyllic experience. Libraries full of books that nobody uses anymore. I mean, who's gone to a library to look for books? They have museums with kind of the tawdry remnants of their alumni donations. They have big fields and stadiums and field houses for the sports teams. what does that have to do with education? When you have places like New England College of Business who are focused on simply the things that add real value to you, teaching you skills, teaching you important concepts and analytical tools, giving you things that will give you traction in your jobs and your careers, and credentialing capable people so that employers can recognize the sacrifices and the learning that you've made. And that's the real value of education. The other 85% of it is waste. Finally, I'll share something that came up between me and my dad when I got my last degree, which was 1978, and it was an expensive degree. And I remember telling my dad, "Wow, this was really an expensive education." And my dad said, "No, Jim. This was the cheapest education you're ever going to get." And I didn't really understand what he meant by that. And I asked him a few years later, and he said, "Well, here's what I meant." I said, Jim, you're going to go out into the workplace, and you're going to make, you're going to start out, and you're going to make $1,000 mistakes. And then if you're successful, you'll have an opportunity to make $10,000 mistakes. And if you're even more successful, you'll have an opportunity to make $100,000 mistakes, maybe even $1 million mistakes, and you will learn from those. And that is perhaps the only wisdom that you all can acquire. It will be from the mistakes you make. And I couldn't really have a beer up here because there's policies, but so I could have this. Don't think of this as a beer glass. Think of it as a vessel of wisdom. And because I can fill it if it's a beer glass, but if it's a vessel of wisdom, you will all learn from the mistakes that you make in your careers, and that will be your most expensive education, but I hope it fills your glass with wisdom. And with that glass, I guess I'd like to finish up by offering a toast to three different sets of people. First, to the faculty and staff that made your success possible. It was really wonderful to read on your website. There's a little section of how I did it with the stories of actually some of the graduates here today and what they went through. And one thing that struck me was the caring and the flexibility and the responsiveness of the faculty to all the life events that happen in grown-ups getting an education. So first to the faculty and staff. Second, to the graduates here who have made a lot of sacrifices, put part of their lives on hold to get the education that you've received and the degree that you're going to get today. And then finally, for the families and the friends of the people who are graduating today, because they're the ones who also made lots of sacrifices, who didn't have time with the graduates here, children who had to spend their evenings being really, really quiet because their parent is working, and spouses who had to spend nights alone. I know the graduates here did what they did not only because of you, but ultimately they did it for you. So cheers.